Hello everybody, well we made it to the end of January. I hope you're still surviving. I hope your New Year's resolutions, if you've made them, are still surviving. Mine is, I won't talk about it now, but if I have time in a future slice, I might just mention how I've managed to keep it going. Now, there's a commercial property case which has received lots of reports in the property press and on websites in the last fortnight, and it's the service charge related case of Sarah and Hossein against Blacks. When is a landlord's conclusive service charge certificate not conclusive? The case is interesting in part because, unlike residential service charges, which are so much a creature of statute, commercial service charges have almost no statutory regulation at all. They are creatures of contract between the supposedly sophisticated landlord and tenant, who, unlike those naive residential flat owners who need statutory protection, are intelligent enough, of course, to formulate the service charge relationship in the lease between them. Any attempts in the past to impose some sort of regulation on commercial service charges, such as the Service Charge Codes 10 years or so ago, have met with only moderate success. So any binding law on commercial service charges will be within case law, not statute. And the decision in Sarah and Hossein and Blacks is certainly good case law, as it's a decision of the highest court in the land, of the Supreme Court, formerly the House of Lords. Blacks, the outdoor clothing people, had premises in Liverpool and were startled by two annual service charge liabilities evidenced by service charge certificates in 2018 and 2019 of more than £400,000 in aggregate for those 2 years, as the previous year's liability had been just £55,000. Now, the lease provided the following. Blacks was to pay a fair and reasonable proportion of the total service cost. The landlord was to deliver a certificate each year as to the amount of the total cost and the sum payable by the tenant, and the certificate was to be conclusive, save in instances of manifest or mathematical error or fraud. Importantly as well for the decision in this case, Blacks had rights, as many tenants do under their leases, to inspect the landlord's service charge receipts, invoices, vouchers and other evidence relating to service charge for a period of 1 year after issue of the service charge certificate. Blacks argued that certain service charges within the certificates were excessive and for unnecessary works and expenses that were not properly due under the lease. The landlord argued that, except to the extent that there was manifest or mathematical error or fraud, its certificates were conclusive as to the costs incurred and as to the sums payable by Blacks. So Blacks had to accept whatever was in the certificate, and that was the end of the matter. The finding of the Supreme Court was that the certificates were conclusive as to the sum payable by Blacks following issue of the certificate, but not conclusive as to Blacks' underlying liability for the service charge. Now, the effect of this was that Blacks were not entitled to withhold payment of the sum now following issue of the certificate, but should pay that sum now and then take further legal action later, should it wish to do so, to dispute its underlying liability for some of the service charge payments. Therefore, in this scenario, the court had adjudged a pay now, argue later approach, which maxim appears in most headlines of the reports of this case. Therefore, this would ensure that the landlord obtained a prompt payment of the service charge following issue of the service charge certificate. To argue otherwise would mean undermining the landlord's cash flow, as the landlord would not have been reimbursed in a timely manner for the costs it had incurred. But the certificate was not the be-all and end-all. It was open to the tenant to argue its liability to pay some of the service charge after it had made that payment to the landlord. And that was consistent with the ability of Blacks under its lease to inspect service charge receipts, invoices and vouchers, enabling it to ascertain whether it had an entitlement to dispute elements of its service charge liability. Landlords of investments are always keen to ensure that there are no irrecoverable expenses that will undermine their yield. The two main hotspots with that in mind are an ability for the landlord fully to recover dilapidations and an ability to ensure that there are no service charge shortfalls in a multi-let investment. That's one of the reasons why commercial leases so often speak of the landlord service charge certification process being conclusive, but landlords will now need to be wary with existing leases of the tenant's continued entitlement after issue of the certificate to dispute elements of the service charge. In new leases, we might be about to see attempts in the drafting by the landlords to tighten the screw in some way. Oh dear. Have yourself a good couple of weeks, and I'll see you again in a fortnight.